I want you to think back, if you can, to the last time you felt that very specific, very uncomfortable knot in your stomach.
Oh, yeah, the one right below your ribs.
Exactly. You know the one. It's that tightening right below the ribs, and it's usually accompanied by this sudden, irrational spike in your heart rate.
Like you're about to run a marathon, but you're just sitting at your desk.
Right. It happens right before you have to say something really difficult to your boss, or, maybe it's to a friend or your partner.
Yeah, your palms get a little sweaty.
Totally. You're standing there, sweaty palms, your brain is just racing, and every single biological instinct you possess is screaming at you to just turn around, close your mouth, and walk away.
Just flee the scene.
Exactly. Well, today, in this deep dive, we are going straight into the eye of that storm. We are going to decode the exact architecture of the difficult conversation.
It's a fascinating topic because it touches literally every part of our lives.
It really does. We're looking at the source material today to figure out the emotional intelligence, the psychological friction, and, the invisible mechanics required to take a situation that feels like a potential fight and turn it into a moment of highly productive connection.
And that physical knot you mentioned is actually the perfect place to start because it reveals this incredible evolutionary mismatch.
What do you mean by mismatch? Like our bodies are getting it wrong?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
The physical reaction you just described, the racing heart, the sweaty palms, that is your autonomic nervous system preparing you for physical combat.
Like fighting off a bear or something.
Right. Yet the actual situation involves absolutely zero physical danger. I mean, we aren't staring down a predator. We're just about to use vocabulary.
You're just about to use words in a conference room.
Exactly. Yet the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, it reacts as if we are stepping onto a literal battlefield.
Wow.
Yeah, it cannot distinguish between a threat to our physical survival and a threat to our social ego.
So our biology is fundamentally betraying us in these moments.
Pretty much, yeah.
We're geared up for a fist fight when what we actually need is just a nuanced discussion about, project deadlines.
Precisely. And that biological hijacking is why we have such a fundamental misunderstanding of conflict itself. We conflate a difficult conversation with a destructive argument.
We just assume they're the exact same thing.
Right. The assumption is that conflict automatically equals pain or anger or a damaged relationship.
It's a very simple survival equation, right? If conflict equals pain, then the logical move is to just avoid the conflict to avoid the pain.
It is logical in the short term, sure, but it is ultimately self-sabotaging.
Because it just festers.
Exactly. Because the psychological research we're looking at today makes a really sharp distinction between unhealthy communication and healthy conflict.
Okay, break that down for us.
Unhealthy communication is exactly what you fear. It's personal attacks, defensive stonewalling, trying to, win a verbal sparring match.
Just trying to destroy the other person's argument.
Right. But healthy conflict is the exact opposite of them. It is the friction that's actually required to establish boundaries, clarify misunderstandings, and, ironically, deepen a relationship.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I want to focus on a specific layer of this fear that jumped out in our notes, especially regarding the cognitive load of these conversations.
Oh, cognitive load is a huge factor here.
Right. Because it is one thing to have a difficult conversation in your native language, but it is a completely different universe when you're navigating this in a second language.
Absolutely.
For English learners, there's this immense compounded fear of being misunderstood or simply using the wrong grammar during a really high-stakes moment.
The cognitive load in that specific scenario is just astronomical. Think about it. You're trying to regulate your nervous system.
Trying not to panic.
Right. You're trying to read the other person's micro-expressions. You're trying to strategize your actual argument. Yeah. And simultaneously, you're running this real-time grammar check on your own syntax in a second language.
That sounds exhausting just thinking about it.
It is. The internal monologue becomes this trap of, am I using the right preposition? Will this phrasing sound rude? Will I look incompetent?
The stakes just feel so incredibly high.
And what happens is that the fear of grammatical imperfection paralyzes the speaker. They end up choosing the safety of silence over the risk of a flawed sentence.
Okay, I have to challenge that a little bit, though.
Sure, go ahead.
If I'm sitting across from a senior manager, right, and I'm trying to negotiate my salary or push back on this massive project, doesn't a broken sentence or the wrong vocabulary fundamentally undermine my authority?
It's a common fear, absolutely.
I mean, doesn't bad grammar just ruin the message?
It feels like it should, right? But the linguistic data points to a very different reality.
Really?
Yes. There is a critical distinction here between semantic perfection and pragmatic competence.
Okay, those are big words. Pragmatic competence.
Basically, pragmatic competence is your ability to achieve your communicative goal, which is creating shared understanding.
Just getting the point across.
Exactly. Think about how native speakers actually talk to each other. If you transcribe a casual, unscripted conversation between two native English speakers, it is honestly a disaster.
Oh, I totally agree. We stumble all the time.
Right. It's full of false starts, grammatical errors, abandoned sentences, backtracking.
Yeah, people do not speak in perfectly formatted paragraphs.
They really don't. Fluency is not about perfection. It's about flow and connection.
Okay, I like that. Flow and connection.
If your ultimate goal is pure understanding, a sincere, respectful, but grammatically flawed sentence is infinitely more effective at solving a workplace problem than perfect, resentful silence.
Wow. Perfect resentful silence. That is such a vivid way to put it.
It's what so many people default to.
It makes total sense. It's like standing on a golf course. You're staring at the ball and you're expecting to play a flawless game on your very first try ever.
That's a great analogy.
Right, because if you wait for the absolute guarantee that your swing will be biomechanically perfect and land right on the green, you are never going to take a swing. You'll literally just stand there forever.
You'll just be frozen on the tee box.
Exactly. At some point, you just have to hit the ball and see where it goes.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. And that fear of hitting the ball into the woods, so to speak, creates a psychological trap that researchers call the easier said than done phenomenon.
The easier said than done phenomenon. Tell me more about that.
Well, we are all incredibly brave in the shower, right?
Oh, absolutely. I win every argument in the shower.
We can script out the perfect, devastatingly articulate monologue while we're driving alone in our cars.
We are geniuses in the car.
Oh, geniuses. But the moment we have to step up and actually speak those words to another human being, the terror sets in because we can no longer control the variables.
We can't control what they say back to us.
Exactly. We cannot control their reaction. And that uncertainty is terrifying.
Which means we need a reliable system. Because we know why we hesitate now, right? The biological fear of conflict, the fear of imperfection, the illusion of control.
We've established the roadblocks, yes.
But let's say I've decided to push past all of that. The knot is still there in my stomach, but I'm going to do it. How do I actually break the ice when a problem has been just festering for weeks?
The opening of the conversation is the most critical phase, by far. The first 10 seconds basically dictate the entire trajectory of the interaction.
10 seconds? That's barely any time at all.
It's fast. If you misstep here, that amygdala hijack we talked about earlier happens to the other person, and the conversation is basically over before it even begins.
Okay, let's ground this in some reality for the listener. There is a case study in our research today about a scenario called missed deadlines.
Oh yes, a classic.
It is incredibly common. So you're on a small team, and one specific team member is just consistently blowing past their deadline.
And it throws everything off.
Right. Because they are late, your work gets delayed, you have to rush at the last minute, and it is infuriating.
The default human reaction in this scenario is usually just passive-aggressive silence.
Yeah, the heavy sighs.
Exactly. You don't say anything directly, but you sigh heavily in meetings,
Yeah.
you send terse emails, and you just hope that they will magically realize their failing and correct their own behavior.
Because nobody wants to be the one to, pull the pin on the grenade and create all this office tension.
But the analysis of this avoidance strategy shows a literally 100% failure rate.
100%.
So it never works.
It never spontaneously resolves itself. Instead, the missed deadlines just continue, and your internal frustration calcifies into this deep, deep resentment.
You just start to hate them.
You do. And by the time you finally reach your breaking point and speak up, you are so flooded with anger that a healthy, productive conversation is virtually impossible. You are just going to attack them. So in this case study, how did they finally initiate the conversation without attacking? Because they eventually had to say something.
They did, and they bypassed the accusation entirely. They used a highly specific cooperative opening framework.
What were the actual words?
The phrasing was, I wanted to talk about something because I think we can improve the way we work together.
Let me process that. I wanted to talk about something because I think we can improve the way we work together.
How does that feel to you?
It doesn't sound like a reprimand at all. It feels almost strangely casual. Like, why does that specific combination of words disarm the situation so well?
Because it is an absolute masterclass in psychological framing. Let's break it apart.
Yeah, let's look under the hood.
The phrase, "I wanted to talk about something," is a gentle primer. It signals that a substantive topic is coming, allowing the other person to mentally transition.
It's like a warning shot, but a polite one.
Exactly. But it doesn't immediately put them on the defensive. Then the phrase, "because I think we can improve," establishes a forward-looking positive intent.
Right. I'm not saying you're terrible.
No, you aren't dragging them backward into their past mistakes. You are pointing toward a better future.
And then the landing, the way we work together.
That is the crucial pivot right there. It shifts the entire dynamic from an individual failing to a systemic issue.
Oh, that's so smart.
It moves the problem from "you are a terrible employee who is ruining my life" to "we are a team and our shared process has a bottleneck that we need to fix."
It creates an alliance.
It establishes an in-group dynamic. It's you and them versus the problem, rather than you versus them.
That makes total sense. You take the blazing spotlight off their personal inadequacy and shine it on the system instead.
Which protects their ego.
And the resolution of this specific case study absolutely blew my mind when I read it.
It's quite the plot twist.
It is. When they finally sat down and used this opening, the person who was missing the deadlines had zero idea that their delays were causing a domino effect for the rest of the team.
Zero idea. And this highlights a profound cognitive bias called the fundamental attribution error.
Fundamental attribution error. What is that exactly?
Well, when someone else makes a mistake, we tend to attribute it to their core character. We say they are lazy, they are selfish, they don't care.
Right. We judge their soul.
But when we make a mistake, we attribute it to our circumstances. We say, "Oh, I was stressed, I was given bad instructions, I was just tired."
We give ourselves all the grace in the world.
Exactly. We spend weeks building up this elaborate narrative that the coworker is intentionally sabotaging the project, when in reality, it was just an asymmetry of information.
They just genuinely didn't have the full picture.
Right.
Which really proves why opening with an accusation is so catastrophic. Because if I had stormed up to their desk and yelled, "Why are you always so lazy?" I would have been attacking someone who genuinely didn't know they were doing anything wrong.
And how they react.
They would have instantly felt unjustly victimized, their walls would immediately go up, and the actual problem of the workflow would be completely lost in the drama of the fight.
Exactly. And this naturally transitions us into the next phase of the architecture.
Because we have to actually state the problem eventually, right?
Yes. The cooperative opening is fantastic for getting them to the table without triggering their defenses.
Yeah.
But at some point, you do have to transition from the abstract idea of improving things to describing the actual tangible problem.
Right. I can't just vaguely talk about team synergy forever. I have to look at them and tell them they're doing something annoying.
You do?
So how do I point out a specific negative behavior without detonating the conversation? Let's use the interrupting coworker scenario from our notes.
Another extremely common workplace issue.
Oh, I've lived this one. You're in a meeting, you are making a brilliant point, and this one person just bulldozes right over you. And it happens in every single meeting.
It's maddening.
The overwhelming biological urge is to glare at them across the table and say, "You always interrupt me."
And from a linguistic and psychological standpoint, that is arguably the most destructive sentence you can possibly deploy.
Really? The most destructive?
Yes. The word "always" is a rigid absolute. And the moment you use an absolute like always or never, you cease describing a behavior and you begin launching an assault on their character.
But wait. If they literally do it in every meeting, isn't saying always just factually accurate? Why is that an assault?
Because human memory simply doesn't work like a spreadsheet. When you say "you always interrupt me," you trigger an immediate overriding defensive reflex in them.
So they stop listening to the core message.
Completely. The other person's brain entirely stops processing your core complaint about the interruption. Instead, all their cognitive resources are instantly diverted to scanning their memory archives for a single instance where they did not interrupt you.
Oh, I see. They are actively hunting for the loophole in my accusation.
Exactly. They immediately think, "That is a lie. Last Thursday, I sat silently for 20 whole minutes while you rambled."
And then you're just arguing about last Thursday.
Right. And suddenly, the entire interaction derails. You are no longer trying to solve a communication issue. You are engaged in this petty, totally unproductive debate about the statistical frequency of their interruptions.
You've given them an out.
You have given them an easy way to invalidate your entire argument just by focusing on your hyperbole.
I have absolutely fallen into that trap more times than I care to admit. So absolutes, like always and never, are completely banned from the toolkit.
Highly recommended to avoid them, yeah.
How do I actually state the problem then? Because if I just sit there and take it, I'm going to explode eventually.
The behavioral framework here is what researchers call the observation plus request structure.
Observation plus request. Okay.
It is designed to be rhetorically unassailable. Step one is the observation. Instead of saying, "You always interrupt me," you state your internal reality.
What does that sound like?
You say, "I notice that sometimes I don't get a chance to finish my thoughts during meetings."
Okay, let's look at that. I notice that sometimes I don't get a chance to finish my thoughts during meetings. It's almost aggressively non-confrontational.
It is.
I mean, I am stating my own experience, my inability to finish a thought, rather than pointing a finger directly at their action.
And the brilliance of this phrasing is that it completely removes the attack vector.
Because they can't argue with my feelings.
Exactly. It is exceptionally difficult for someone to argue with your personal observation of your own experience.
Yeah.
If you say, "You interrupt me," they can easily say, "No, I don't."
Right.
But if you say, "I notice I don't get to finish my thoughts," they cannot logically say, "Yes, you do finish your thoughts. You own the data of your own experience."
But isn't there a risk that it's just, well, too subtle?
How so?
Like, if I just make an observation, aren't they just going to nod and say, "Wow, that really sucks for you," and then just keep interrupting me?
That is exactly why the observation cannot stand alone. It must be immediately followed by step two, which is the request.
Okay, the request.
The framework suggests following up the observation with, "I'd appreciate it if I could finish my point before we move on."
Now, I noticed in the research that they didn't just say, "Please stop interrupting." They used this very specific, "I'd appreciate it if" structure.
They did, and for a good reason.
But why not just be direct? "Please stop" is clear, it's fast.
Directness is fine in some contexts, but here, a direct command like "please stop interrupting" triggers a power dynamic issue.
It sounds bossy.
Exactly. It sounds like you are acting as their manager or a scolding parent. It threatens their autonomy.
And nobody likes being told what to do by a peer.
Right. But saying "I'd appreciate it if" frames the behavior change as a request between equals. You are essentially inviting them to grant you a favor, which really appeals to their desire to be seen as a cooperative, reasonable colleague.
You're giving them the agency to choose to be polite.
Yes, rather than forcing compliance.
So the full package is, I notice that sometimes I don't get a chance to finish my thoughts during meetings. I'd appreciate it if I could finish my point before we move on.
Simple, clean, effective.
It's clean, it's irrefutable, and it completely protects their ego. But this brings up a massive caveat for me.
Okay, let's hear it.
It is one thing to manage the ego of a peer in a meeting, right? Someone on your same level. But what happens when the power dynamics are reversed?
Managing up.
Yes. Yeah. What happens when I fundamentally disagree with someone who literally has the power to fire me?
Disagreeing upwards. It is one of the most fraught professional experiences you can have.
It's terrifying.
The anxiety stems from this deeply held assumption that dissent equals insubordination. We fear that if we push back on a manager's idea, we will instantly be labeled as difficult, inflexible, or not a team player.
Which is terrifying because those are the people who write the performance reviews.
Exactly.
If my boss proposes a strategy that I know is going to crash and burn, my instinct is just to nod, execute the bad strategy, and then quietly update my resume when it inevitably fails.
And that silent compliance is exactly what creates toxic and ineffective organizations.
Really? Because I thought I was just being a good soldier.
The leadership literature is very clear on this, actually. A healthy management structure requires alternative viewpoints. A good manager doesn't actually want a team of sycophants who will just let them walk off a cliff.
They want pushback.
They need pushback, provided that the pushback is delivered through a professional, respectful framework.
The million-dollar question, then, is how to deliver that dissent without sounding like a rebellious teenager. How do I tell my boss they are wrong without actually using the word wrong?
Yeah, that's it. There is a highly effective linguistic sequence for this. The first tool is the acknowledgement pivot.
The acknowledgement pivot? What's the phrase?
The phrase is, "I see your point, but I have a different perspective."
Let me stop you right there, because the word "but" always feels incredibly dangerous to me.
Really? Why is that?
Doesn't saying "but" completely erase whatever I said right before it? Like if someone says, "You're a great worker, but," I know something terrible is coming.
It is a valid concern, and it depends entirely on how the first half of that sentence is delivered.
What do you mean?
The phrase, "I see your point," cannot just be filler. It must be a genuine validation of their logic. You have to prove you actually listen to them.
So I can't just mumble it.
No, you might even expand it. You could say, "I see your point about needing to cut costs this quarter, but I have a different perspective on how this specific cut will affect client retention."
Okay, that feels much more grounded.
The validation satisfies their ego and their authority. Once their authority is fully acknowledged, their brain is much more receptive to the divergent opinion that follows the but.
You essentially have to pay a toll to their ego before you can drive your new idea onto the road.
That's a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
What's the next tool in the sequence?
The inquiry method. The phrase is, "Have we considered another approach?"
I actually love that because it operates entirely as a question, not a statement.
Exactly. Stating, "Your strategy is flawed," initiates a direct confrontation. But asking, "Have we considered another approach?" opens a collaborative door.
It's so much softer.
You are not challenging their intellect. You are inviting them to explore a new territory alongside you. It completely bypasses their defensive reflex because you aren't telling them what to do. You are simply asking if an alternative reality has been mapped out yet.
I want to dig into a philosophical tangent here that our research touches on because this whole conversation about framing and softening language brings up a major debate.
Oh, the directness debate.
Yes. Is direct communication inherently rude? Like if I'm working with a boss and I just say, "No, I disagree, that won't work," is that always a failure of emotional intelligence?
Not at all. If we look at cross-cultural communication studies, the answer is heavily dependent on context.
Context is everything.
It really is. Neither direct nor indirect communication is objectively superior to the other. They're just different operating systems.
Like Mac versus PC.
Precisely. In low-context cultures and in certain highly analytical corporate environments, saying, "I disagree," is actually the gold standard. It is viewed as efficient, honest, and deeply respectful of everyone's limited time.
But if I took that exact same directness and dropped it into a different environment, it would be a complete disaster.
A total disaster. In high-context cultures, which rely heavily on relational harmony and reading between the lines, a blunt "No, I disagree" is not just rude.
How is it seen?
It is perceived as an aggressive, destabilizing attack on the social order of the group. The meaning of the words is entirely dictated by the unwritten rules of the room you are standing in.
Which means we need options.
This is exactly why having a toolkit of softer, inquisitive phrases like "Have we considered another approach?" is so critical. It gives you the flexibility to navigate different environments, adapting your delivery to ensure your underlying message actually survives the translation.
Okay, so we've established how to open without attacking, how to describe the problem objectively, and how to disagree respectfully even when we lack power.
We've built a solid foundation.
But if the conversation stops there, we haven't actually accomplished anything. I mean, a disagreement without a path forward is really just an elegant complaint.
That's a great point.
We have to pivot to solutions, which brings us to what might be the hardest two-letter word in the English language to deploy effectively.
The word "no."
Yes. Saying no to a peer or a manager who is asking for help. It is structurally simple, but psychologically agonizing, and it is honestly one of the primary engines of professional burnout.
Because the fear of disappointing people is so deeply ingrained in us.
It really is. If a coworker comes to me, they're stressed out, and they ask me to take on part of their project, I instantly think, if I say no, I am a bad person.
I am not a team player.
Exactly. They will resent me. So I say yes, even when I am already drowning in my own work.
And the irony of that people-pleasing reflex is that it inevitably damages the very relationships you are desperately trying to protect.
How so?
Well, when you take on more than you can handle, your cognitive resources deplete, the quality of your work plummets, you miss your own deadlines, and you end up letting the team down anyway.
So you fail at helping them.
Yes. Plus, you build a silent resentment toward the person who asked for help, even though you voluntarily agreed to do it.
Oh man, that is so true. So how do we say no without fracturing the relationship and without looking completely unhelpful?
The framework for this is called the positive intention plus limitation structure.
Positive intention plus limitation.
Instead of a flat, dismissive, "I can't do that," or a stressed out, "I don't have time," you structure the response like this. You say, "I'd like to help, but I don't think I have enough time to do it properly right now. Maybe we can look at the timeline and see what is possible.
Let's put that under the microscope. I'd like to help, but why does that first clause matter so much?
Because it validates the social bond before introducing the logistical boundary.
It pets the landing.
Exactly. I'd like to help communicate a crucial underlying message. It says, I value you as a colleague, I support your objectives, and if circumstances were different, I would absolutely be on your team.
So it's not a rejection of them as a human.
Exactly. It separates the rejection of the specific task from the rejection of the person. You're rejecting the workload, not the relationship.
And then the limitation is introduced not as a lack of desire, but as a defense of quality.
Yes, notice the phrasing.
I don't have time to do it properly right now. I'm not saying I'm too lazy. I'm saying my standards are too high to do a rush job for you.
It's a very subtle but powerful shift.
That's a brilliant pivot.
Yeah.
And then closing with, maybe we can look at the timeline.
That closing shifts you from being an obstacle to being a consultant.
Oh, I like that. A consultant.
You are refusing to do the manual labor of the task, but you are offering your strategic labor to help them solve their scheduling problem. You remain a supportive team player without sacrificing your own boundaries.
We can scale this exact same positive framing up to the most terrifying conversations we ever have in our careers, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like negotiating workload with a boss or asking for more money.
Those are functionally identical scenarios. They are just high-stakes versions of saying no to the current terms of your employment.
Let's look at the workload negotiation first. Say I'm doing the job of 3 people, I'm exhausted, and I desperately need my boss to take some tasks off my plate.
A very common burnout scenario.
If I walk in and say, you gave me too much work, I am completely stressed out and I can't do this, what happens?
You trigger a defensive reaction in your manager. You are essentially accusing them of poor management. And by focusing entirely on your personal stress, you risk sounding like you simply lack resilience.
They just think I can't hack it.
Right. The conversation becomes about your emotional state, which is very subjective and very difficult to negotiate.
But if I use the framework we just discussed, I can frame my boundary around mutual success.
Let's hear it.
The phrasing in our notes is, I wanted to discuss my current workload because I'm trying to make sure I can maintain the quality of my work.
Notice the alignment of incentives there. What does every manager fundamentally care about?
Quality output.
Quality output and successful metrics. By framing your need for a reduced workload as a strategic necessity to maintain quality, you transform yourself from a complaining employee into a proactive high-level partner.
I'm helping them by helping myself.
You are protecting their interest by protecting your capacity.
And when it comes to salary negotiation, the stakes feel even higher. The instinct there is to make it super personal.
Oh, always.
People say, my rent went up, inflation is crazy, I really need a raise.
Which is an emotional plea. And while those factors are incredibly real to you, they are completely irrelevant to the business logic of a corporation.
That's a harsh reality.
It is. But the company does not pay you based on your personal expenses. They pay you based on your market value.
So the script pivots to an objective foundation. You say, based on my experience and recent project successes, I was hoping we could discuss my compensation.
The phrase based on is doing some really heavy lifting there.
How so?
It anchors the entire conversation in empirical data. You are establishing a logical premise. And the phrase I was hoping we could discuss functions much like the cooperative opening we discussed earlier.
It's an invitation.
Exactly. It's an invitation to a dialogue rather than a rigid ultimatum.
If we zoom out and look at all of these scripts, from the missed deadlines to the interrupting coworker, all the way up to salary negotiation, there is a very clear repeating rhythm here.
Yes, there's a distinct pattern.
It's a 4-step architectural pattern. Step 1 is acknowledge the other person or the shared goal. Step 2 is explain your perspective, your observation, or your limitation.
Right.
Step 3 is suggest a solution or an alternative. And step 4 is invite discussion. Acknowledge, explain, suggest, invite.
That sequence is incredibly robust.
Yeah.
If you can map your thoughts onto that framework, it is exceptionally difficult for a conversation to devolve into a toxic fight.
I agree completely. But I have a major problem with everything we've discussed so far.
Oh, what's the problem?
It is entirely theoretical.
Fair point.
We have this perfect, logical, linguistic framework. We know the 4 steps. But what happens when the real world actually hits?
When things get messy.
Right. What happens when my heart rate is at 130 beats per minute, my face is completely flushed, my vision is narrowing, and I am absolutely furious because my coworker just threw me under the bus in a meeting?
The adrenaline dump.
Yes. Because I can memorize all the polite four-step phrases in the world, but when the adrenaline spikes, all that logic just flies right out the window. How do we handle the intense, messy, emotional reality of these moments?
This brings us to what psychological researchers call the emotional control room.
The emotional control room sounds intense.
And the most profound insight required to master this room is a complete reframing of how we conceptualize our own feelings.
Because we usually think of feelings as bad in the workplace.
Exactly. In professional settings, we are relentlessly conditioned to view emotions as liabilities. We are told to suppress them, to be objective, to be purely logical.
Just be a robot.
Right. But the psychological reality is that emotions are not the enemy. They are raw data.
They are data. I love that. It's like the dashboard warning lights in your car.
That's a great way to look at it.
If you're driving down the highway and the red check engine light flashes on, you don't panic and smash the dashboard with a hammer to make the light turn off, right?
You hope not.
You understand that the light is a mechanical signal telling you something is happening under the hood. Emotions are the exact same thing.
Yes.
Anger is a flashing red light that means a boundary was just crossed. Disappointment is a light that indicates an unmet expectation. The emotion is just a messenger trying to deliver a status report.
That is a phenomenal analogy. You have to read the signal without letting the signal drive the car.
Right. Don't let the check engine light drive the car.
The catastrophic failure point in difficult conversations is the immediate, unedited emotional reaction. It is the classic angry email phenomenon.
Oh, we've all been there.
You read an infuriating message at 4 p.m., your anger spikes, and you furiously type out a blistering reply and hit send.
It feels so good for about 5 seconds.
In that moment, your subconscious goal has completely shifted. You are no longer trying to solve the workplace problem. Your only goal is to discharge your own emotional pain by inflicting it on the other person.
You just want them to hurt as much as you are hurting.
Exactly.
And then you wake up the next morning and feel this deep sense of dread about what you sent.
Because the emotion is metabolized, the refractory period has ended, and your logical brain comes back online to survey the wreckage.
The damage is done.
This is why the single most powerful tool in the emotional control room is the pause. The deliberate enforced space between experiencing the emotional stimulus and choosing your behavioral response.
But how do we actually execute that pause in real time? If we are face-to-face in a room, I can't just stare at them silently for 20 minutes while I process my anger. They'd think I was crazy.
No, you can't do that. But you can utilize what the research identifies as a highly counterintuitive secret weapon, which is tactical silence and active listening.
Tactical silence.
We tend to view verbal communication as a turn-based combat system. I talk, then I wait for you to stop making noise so I can launch my next argument.
Right. While they are talking, I'm not actually really listening. I'm just mentally reloading my weapon and waiting for a pause so I can fire back.
Exactly. But utilizing tactical silence, which means deploying small, affirming, non-combative responses like I see. That makes sense. Or tell me more about how you view that situation accomplishes two massive things simultaneously.
What's the first thing?
First, it buys your nervous system time to regulate. You don't have to formulate a brilliant defense. You just have to stay curious.
And the second?
Second, it forces you out of your defensive posture. Tell me more about that. Is a phrase rooted in genuine curiosity. Neurologically, it is virtually impossible to be in a state of furious, defensive rage and a state of genuine curiosity at the exact same time. The curiosity naturally cools the anger.
Tell me more about that. It completely flips the dynamic. Instead of pushing against their argument, you are stepping aside and asking them to elaborate on it, which often diffuses their own hostility.
It takes the wind right out of their sails.
And this ties perfectly into what our notes call the ultimate de-escalation question, particularly for personal relationships.
Yes, the personal sphere.
Because outside of the office, how often do we get into massive fights with our partners or friends simply because we misdiagnosed what they actually needed from us in that moment?
The jump to solutions trap. It is incredibly common, especially for analytical thinkers.
So common.
Your partner comes home, they are deeply upset about something that happened at work, and within 30 seconds, you are outlining a 3-step action plan for how they should confront their boss tomorrow.
And instead of being super grateful for my brilliant action plan, they get even angrier at me.
Because by immediately jumping to a logistical solution, you have inadvertently invalidated their emotional experience.
Oh.
You have essentially communicated that their complex feelings are just a simple math problem that needs to be solved and dismissed as quickly as possible. You haven't made them feel heard.
So what is the ultimate de-escalation question?
When someone comes to you highly emotionally charged, before you offer a single piece of advice, you ask, do you want advice right now, or do you just want me to listen?
It is so simple, but it acts like a circuit breaker. Do you want advice, or do you just want me to listen?
It gives them complete agency over the interaction.
And it tells you exactly what role you're supposed to play. If they just need to vent, you can sit back, use tactical silence, and just validate their experience without feeling the pressure to fix it.
It saves countless arguments just by aligning expectations before the conversation even really begins.
Okay, we have the architectural frameworks, we have the emotional control room, and we understand the linguistics. I want to put all of this to the test right now.
Let's do it.
Let's run this through a real-world gauntlet. Our research is packed with these highly relatable, deeply awkward scenarios. Let's see how the mechanics hold up when things get messy.
I'm ready.
Scenario A, the flaky friend. You have a friend you've known for years. But lately, they constantly cancel plans at the very last minute.
Frustrating.
You get the text, so sorry, can't make it tonight. You are sitting on your couch, already dressed to go out, and you are furious.
The emotional dashboard light is flashing bright red. The immediate impulse is to send back an absolute accusation. You draft the text, you never respect my time. Why do we even bother making plans?
Which, based on what we've learned, is a guaranteed fight.
Guaranteed.
It attacks their character and uses the absolute never. They will immediately defend themselves by listing all the times they did show up. The friendship just becomes a battleground.
It completely derails.
So how do we address the real hurt without starting a war?
You focus purely on the emotional data and your own observation. The action is to say, I feel really disappointed when our plans change at the last minute because I was so looking forward to spending time with you.
Let's analyze that. I feel disappointed. That's owning my own emotional state.
Yes.
When our plans change at the last minute, that is an objective observation of the event, not an attack on their personality.
Perfect observation.
Because I was looking forward to spending time with you, that anchors the entire message in my affection for them.
It is incredibly disarming. It holds them accountable for the impact of their actions, but it does so by emphasizing the value of the relationship. It's very difficult to react defensively when someone is essentially saying, I am upset because I like you so much.
Okay, let's move to scenario B, asking for and receiving feedback. This is a minefield in the workplace.
Oh, absolutely.
When a project wraps up, the worst thing you can say to your manager or peer is, tell me what's wrong with my work.
By asking what is wrong, you are cognitively priming the other person to hunt for flaws.
You're asking them to find problems.
Right. You are also placing yourself in a defensive, subordinate posture before they even open their mouth. You are basically bracing for impact.
The pivot here from the notes is so subtle but powerful. Instead of asking what's wrong, you ask, is there anything I could improve for next time?
That completely changes the temporal focus.
Explain that.
What's wrong looks backward at the past, which cannot be changed, leading to defensiveness. But what can I improve looks forward to the future.
It's actionable.
It signals a growth mindset and a willingness to learn, transforming the feedback from a punishment for past mistakes into a strategic tool for future success.
But asking is only half the battle. The truly hard part is receiving the feedback. Even if you ask for it constructively, when someone actually critiques your work, the visceral knee-jerk reaction is intense.
Oh, the ego hates it.
Your brain immediately starts screaming, they have no idea how hard I worked on this, they don't appreciate my effort, they are entirely wrong.
That is the ego desperately trying to protect itself. And this is exactly where the tactical pause is vital.
How do you respond in that moment, though?
The most mature, emotionally intelligent response you can deploy in that exact moment, even if you fundamentally disagree with every single word of their critique, is to simply say, thanks for pointing that out.
Just thanks for pointing that out, but doesn't that imply I agree with them?
No, it implies you heard them. You do not have to agree, you do not have to implement their suggestions, but you must acknowledge receipt of the data they provided without becoming instantly defensive.
You're just taking the delivery.
Exactly. It allows the conversation to end gracefully, giving you the time and space to process the feedback objectively later when your ego isn't actively under threat.
Wow. Okay, scenario C, the true apology. This is one that so many people get wrong.
So many.
The research makes a strong point that apologizing is an act of strength, not weakness, because it requires immense self-assurance to actually admit fault. But there is a specific linguistic trap that masquerades as an apology.
Yes. The faux apology. It is one of the most toxic phrases in modern communication.
Yes, the terrible, infuriating, absolute worst apology. I'm sorry you felt that way.
Or, I'm sorry if you were offended.
It makes my blood boil just hearing it.
When you say, I'm sorry you felt that way, you are engaging in subtle gaslighting.
Totally.
You are entirely shifting the locus of blame away from your actions and placing it squarely onto the other person's emotional reaction.
You're saying you're the crazy one.
You are essentially communicating, I behaved perfectly fine, and it is a shame that your emotional processing is so flawed and fragile. It guarantees the conflict will escalate.
It is maddening to be on the receiving end of that. So the correct action, the true apology, requires two distinct pillars. First, you take absolute ownership. You say, I'm sorry my words hurt you. You connect your action directly to the impact.
Yes, ownership is step one.
And second, you must outline the behavioral change. In the future, I will make sure to check with you before bringing up that topic in a group setting. An apology without a commitment to change behavior is just manipulation.
Exactly. It's just a sequence of words designed to get you out of trouble, rather than a genuine attempt to repair the rupture in the relationship.
Okay, scenario D, the unreturned book.
The awkward one.
Very awkward. A friend borrows something, a book, a tool, a sweater, and weeks go by and they just forget to return it. It feels so petty to bring it up, but it quietly bothers you every time you see them.
The trap here is the internal narrative we construct. We start assuming they are keeping it maliciously or that they are profoundly careless and disrespectful of our property.
We make them out to be villains.
The action here is all about stripping away those assumptions.
The script is remarkably mundane, which I guess is why it works. You just say, hey, I just wanted to check if you still have that book I lent you. Could you bring it back sometime this week?
So simple.
There are no accusations, no demands for an apology, just a gentle observation of reality and a polite logistical request.
And finally, scenario E, which is perhaps the heaviest one. Repairing a rift.
When things are really broken.
A major conflict has already occurred. Angry words were exchanged. Things are tense. And the awkward, heavy silence has stretched on for days. How do you break the ice when the water is that thick?
The action provided in the notes is this. I know things have been difficult between us recently, but I don't want this specific issue to affect our overall relationship.
If we deconstruct what that sentence is doing psychologically, it is zooming out.
Zooming out.
When we are entrenched in a conflict, we develop profound tunnel vision. Our entire perspective shrinks down to the specific issue.
The missed deadline or the rude comment?
The argument over money. We lose sight of the surrounding context. That sentence breaks the tunnel vision.
I see.
It reminds both parties that the relationship itself, the years of friendship, the successful working history, the shared goals, is significantly larger and more valuable than the isolated issue you are currently fighting about. It anchors the dialogue in shared value.
As we approach the final segment of our deep dive today, I want to look at the granular mechanical linguistics that make all of these frameworks actually function.
Let's get into the mechanics.
Because earlier we talked about the fear English learners have regarding vocabulary. But our research highlights a fascinating point. Learning the vocabulary is actually the easy part. A dictionary can teach you vocabulary. The true masterclass of human communication lies in tone.
Tone is the invisible architecture supporting every single word you speak. It is the music playing underneath the lyrics.
That's a great metaphor.
The research notes a brilliant example of this. Two people can use the exact same vocabulary, the simple phrase that's interesting, and deliver entirely different realities.
Yes. Let's act this out. If I lean forward, raise my pitch slightly, and say, oh, that's interesting, I'm signaling engagement, curiosity, and warmth.
Exactly.
But if I cross my arms, lower my pitch, and say flatly, well, that's interesting, I am signaling profound skepticism, judgment, and hostility.
It's the exact same words.
Entirely different galaxies of meaning.
Which demonstrates why tone is exponentially harder to master than grammar. Grammar operates on a set of fixed rules you can memorize from a textbook. Tone requires real-time emotional attunement.
You have to read the room.
It requires an understanding of the power dynamics, the history of the relationship, the context of the room, and the subtle physical inflections of the human voice. You cannot learn tone from a book. You have to learn it from interacting with people.
And it also involves mastering the intent behind idioms. The research breaks down the phrase, "I understand where you're coming from."
A classic idiom.
If you are an English learner and you translate that sentence literally in your head, it sounds like we are discussing physical geography. Like, yes, I understand you took the train here from Chicago.
But the pragmatics of that phrase have absolutely nothing to do with geography. It is one of the most profound empathetic statements in the English language.
What does it really mean?
It is a psychological acknowledgement. It says, I see the unique sequence of life experiences, the underlying logic and the emotional context that led you to arrive at this specific conclusion. It is the ultimate validating statement you can use before introducing a divergent opinion.
Our notes also provide this amazing softening toolkit for the English language. They contrast direct, rigid language with softer, more effective alternatives. We touched on this concept earlier with the interrupting coworker, but let's look closer at the actual mechanics.
Let's do it.
Instead of saying, "you are wrong," which is basically a conversational brick wall, you say, "I think there might be another way to look at this." And instead of, "you don't listen to me," which triggers instant defensiveness, you say, "I feel like my ideas haven't been fully heard."
It's a huge shift in tone.
But the real magic trick in English, according to this linguistic breakdown, is the computational use of modal verbs.
Modal verbs are fascinating. Words like could, would, and possibly. We often use them without thinking, but computationally, they act as shock absorbers for the human ego.
Shock absorbers.
They soften the impact of a demand without actually changing the destination of the request.
How do they actually do that, though? How does adding the word could change how the brain processes the sentence?
A modal verb introduces conditionality. It creates a hypothetical space. If I look at you and say, review this report by Friday, I am issuing a direct imperative. I am trapping you in a command, which can trigger the amygdala's threat response regarding autonomy.
I feel bossed around.
But if I say, could you possibly review this report by Friday? I have transformed the imperative into a conditional reality. Grammatically, I am offering you an exit route.
Even if I don't really have a choice.
Exactly. By giving you the theoretical option to say no, I remove the feeling of being trapped. And paradoxically, by offering you the freedom to refuse, I drastically increase the likelihood that your cooperative instincts will kick in and you will say yes.
It's a linguistic sleight of hand. You haven't lost any core meaning. The deadline is still Friday and I still need you to do the work, but you have entirely changed the emotional tone of the transaction.
It's a very powerful tool.
But I have to push back on this because I see this go terribly wrong all the time in offices. Can you be too soft? Because some people are so terrified of conflict that they use every single modal verb in the dictionary in one sentence, and the actual point they are trying to make gets completely lost in a fog of politeness.
That is the trap of extreme indirectness, and it is a major operational issue in many workplaces. When you stack that many softeners and modal verbs together, you don't sound respectful, you sound insecure, and more importantly, you introduce ambiguity.
The research had this hilariously extreme example of someone trying to assign a task without sounding bossy. The sentence was, "I was wondering if maybe at some point you might be able to possibly look at this."
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
If you're the person receiving that sentence, you have absolutely no idea what the parameters are. Is this an urgent, high-priority task? Is it a casual suggestion for next month? Is it just a random thought?
It's so confusing.
Extreme politeness destroys clarity.
So where is the line? How do we balance respect with clarity?
The linguistic analysis indicates that the perfect balance is directness wrapped in a single layer of respect. Instead of the extreme rambling sentence, you strip it down and deploy one modal verb and one politeness marker.
Like what?
You say, could you please review this by Friday? The core request is sharp, the timeline is unmistakable, but the packaging is respectful. Directness and politeness are not mutually exclusive. They are two elements that must be balanced perfectly.
Respect. That really is the core foundation of everything we've unpacked today, isn't it?
It really is.
If we synthesize this entire hour, all the behavioral frameworks, the observation plus request model, the psychological reframing of the emotional dashboard, the careful deployment of modal verbs, it all ultimately boils down to a posture of respect.
It does. You can disagree with someone passionately. You can be deeply, viscerally frustrated with a coworker's performance. You can have fundamentally different emotional needs than your partner. But the moment mutual respect leaves the interaction, it ceases to be communication and simply devolves into a fight for dominance.
The respect has to stay.
With a foundation of respect and the tools to maintain it, you can navigate almost any human disagreement.
Which brings us to our challenge for you, our listener. We want you to take the architecture we've explored today and apply it to the messy reality of your own life.
Put it into practice.
I want you to think of one specific conversation that you are currently actively avoiding. You know exactly which one it is. It's the one that made your stomach tighten the moment I just mentioned it.
We all have one.
I want you to ask yourself, why are you avoiding it? Are you operating under the flawed survival equation that conflict equals pain? Are you waiting for your argument to be absolutely bulletproof?
Waiting for perfection.
Once you identify the fear, your challenge is to prepare just one simple opening sentence. You do not need a 20-minute script. You just need the cooperative icebreaker.
Keep it simple.
Use the framework. I'd like to talk about something that has been on my mind because I think we can improve how we handle this situation moving forward. You don't have to solve the entire problem in one sitting. You just have to have the courage to start the conversation.
And as you prepare to initiate that dialogue, I want to leave you with a final philosophical thought to mull over. It builds on a concept from our behavioral research regarding unspoken expectations.
Unspoken expectations.
We spend a massive amount of our lives feeling frustrated, let down, and resentful regarding what other people do or fail to do. But consider this. What if 90% of your relational frustrations aren't actually about the other person's actions at all?
Wait, what are they about then?
What if those frustrations are entirely generated by the invisible scripts and expectations that you wrote for them in your own head, but never actually bothered to read aloud to them?
Oh, wow.
We walk around expecting our colleagues, our friends, and our partners to intuitively understand our boundaries, to anticipate our needs, and to respect our unspoken timelines. But human beings cannot read minds.
They really can't.
So this raises a deeply provocative question. If the people in your life cannot read your mind, is your silence, your avoidance of the difficult conversation, actually a profound form of unfairness to them?
Oh, wow. Is your silence a form of unfairness? That entirely flips the paradigm.
It changes everything.
You tell yourself you are avoiding the conversation to keep the peace or to be nice, but in reality, your silence is actively preventing them from succeeding in the relationship. You are grading them on a test where you hid the syllabus. That is incredibly powerful.
It's a tough truth to swallow, but it's liberating once you do.
And suddenly, that uncomfortable knot in your stomach, the one we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive, it doesn't feel like a biological warning sign to run away anymore.
Not at all.
It feels like a signal that it is time to open your mouth, step into the healthy friction, and actually build the understanding you've been waiting for. You have the frameworks, you understand the mechanics, now go take the swing.